So hello and welcome to another episode of TopTenz. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about 10 terrifying, lesser-known historical epidemics. Yes, I know, striking while the iron is hot with this one. Something I find oddly comforting to think about in a dark and macabre way is that I have something in common with everybody watching this at home. We've all lived through a pandemic, or the dark times as we call it to avoid upsetting YouTube's algorithm. But just because the Rona was unprecedented in modern times doesn't mean this sort of thing hasn't happened before. In fact, it's happened at least 10 times, because that's the format of the show. Number 10. The Antonine Plague. Spanning from AD 165 to 180, the Antonine Plague devastated the Roman Empire, although what exactly caused it was unclear, though descriptions of what befell the citizens of Rome, 2,000 of whom died per day, the apex of the plague's deadliness, has led to experts concluding it was likely a form of smallpox, to which the Romans had no immunity, the vaccine not having been invented yet, and something the entire pantheon of gods they worship couldn't protect them from, regardless of how many sheep they set ablaze. The origins of the plague are similarly unclear. Spoilers, get used to me saying that, though again, it's the best guess of experts and people with PhDs and glasses and all that stuff that it was brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the Near East. At the time, though, it was believed that the plague was divine punishment caused by co-emperor, a position I didn't know existed in the Roman Empire, Lucius Verus opening a tomb during the sacking of a city. Don't worry though, Lucius Verus got his, dying from this plague, alongside thousands of his Roman compatriots. So many Roman compatriots, in fact, that the plague is often linked to the downfall of the Roman Empire itself, which sounds unimaginable for something so powerful and globe-spanning, until you consider that 10% of Rome's population was wiped out by this plague. Moving on, number 9, the Athens Plague. For a moment, imagine it's 430 BC and you're a random Athenian soldier tasked with fighting the Spartans, on land, in hand-to-hand combat. You find yourself thinking, how could things possibly be worse? The answer is, of course, a mysterious illness that has wiped out 25% of the population of the city you're tasked with defending. The exact cause and nature of the Athens Plague are unclear, with theories ranging from toxic shock syndrome to the bubonic plague. All we know for sure is that it sucks for pretty much everyone, given one of the more unusual symptoms was the uncontrollable urge for people to submerge themselves in water, which no doubt led to its further spread. Just spoilers, you don't want people with a communicable disease jumping into your drinking water. Of note, though, is that the invading army of Spartans seemed oddly immune to the plague, leading to many in Athens to suspect that they had something to do with it, or that the gods were on the Spartan side. Whatever the case, the Spartans wanted approximately none of that and withdrew from the city. Yes, the same army that once stood their ground against an entire empire, whose fighting prowess is the stuff of legend and Zack Snyder movies, wanted nothing to do with this illness and ran away from it. And if that doesn't get across how dangerous it was, nothing does. Number 8, the Dancing Plague of 1518. Possibly the most famous example of a plague on this list, but one we couldn't not mention because it's just so compellingly bizarre. The short version is that, seemingly out of nowhere, in 1518, the French city of Strasbourg, people started dancing, and then just didn't stop. So these people, they danced until their feet bled, until they literally collapsed of exhaustion, still kicking as they fell, and even until their hearts gave out and they died of a combination of hunger, dehydration, and the delirium brought on by lack of sleep. At least we think so. The exact death toll of this particular plague is debated, and yes, this is described as a plague in academic literature because the dancing seemed to spread much akin to a virus. And unlike a lot of the other things on this list, we can point to a definitive cause of this plague, that being a single woman called Frau Trophaea, who randomly began dancing in the streets, which of course attracted curious onlookers and rubberneckers who also, for reasons they couldn't explain, also began to dance. Now at this point you're probably thinking, why didn't someone try, just pushing the people over or grabbing them and forcing them into their homes or to sit down or something like that? Well, the authorities did try this and it didn't go well. The sufferers violently thrashed about and kicked at their captors with their bloodied, swollen feet. In the specific case of the Dancing Plague's patient Zero, Frau Trophaea, her own husband spent the first day she was dancing fruitlessly trying to get her to stop until she collapsed in the middle of the street and slept throughout the night, unable to be roused from the slumber by her husband or dragged into the home without kicking at him, until the morning when she woke up and started dancing again. In the end, the authorities decided to just let people sort of dance it out of their system and left them to it, eventually just grabbing the survivors and taking them to a nearby holy shrine to pray for salvation. Number 7, the Plague of Cyprian. Back to the Roman Empire now and the Plague of Cyprian, which makes the Antonine Plague look like the sniffles. With this pandemic being so severe, it was frequently described by those at the time as being akin to the end of the world, which may sound a little cataclysmic until you consider that the plague struck when the Roman Empire was basically being attacked on all sides, as well as literally from within by the plague. Exactly what this plague was is again a frustrating mystery, though theories tend to point to a Thelia virus, think Ebola, with experts suggesting it was likely transmitted to humans by animals and then spread from there. Though again, nobody is quite sure this did happen in 250 AD after all. As for how deadly the plague was, this is also unclear. Again, we're talking about something that happened over 1,000 years ago, though the rough numbers gleaned from historical accounts aren't pretty, with some suggesting that cities like Alexandria lost 60% of the population to the creeping pestilence. Moving on, number 6, the 1890 Russian flu. Of all the things listed so far, the Russian or Asiatic flu, as it's sometimes known, probably has the lowest mortality rate, being as low as 0.1% in healthy individuals, yet it somehow claimed over 1 million lives. How? Well, that's due to a confluence of events that allowed the virus to ravage not just Russia, but the whole world. The main one being the rapid expansion of global trade and industry caused by the Industrial Revolution. This, coupled with the high contagiousness of the virus, helped the Asiatic flu become the first, literally global pandemic, with studies accurately, if terrifyingly, referring to the virus as a planetary event, which is not great. Exactly what the virus was is, you've guessed it, unclear, though until the outbreak of COVID-19, the culprit was often thought to be Myxovirus influenzae, the flu, hence the name Russian flu. However, there is evidence to suggest it could have been a form of coronavirus, the symptoms of which often mimic those of influenza and would suggest the cause was an animal of some kind. Annoyingly though, like with virtually everything else on this list, we just don't know for sure, as is the nature of an epidemic or pandemic in this case. Of note though is the initial response to the Russian flu or Asiatic flu being eerily similar to that of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the virus being likened to nothing more than a bad cold in newspapers in places like America, even when the virus they were playing down had already killed hundreds upon hundreds of thousands. We're never going to learn, are we? Number 5, the 1916 New York polio epidemic. Speaking of America, let's talk about the 1916 New York City polio epidemic and the fact that for this one, authorities kind of had their metaphorical crap together, which likely has something to do with the fact that polio is bad. Like, really bad. As in, you'll be paralysed for life if you're lucky, with the virus causing bodily paralysis that spreads throughout the body, starting at your legs before moving up your body towards your major organ. When it reaches your lungs, that's usually when you die, unless they can get you into the contraption, aka an iron lung, which may help or may become the tomb in which you spend the rest of your life. Not that anyone in 1916 had to worry about that, the iron lung had yet to be invented. While the epidemic is believed to have originated in Brooklyn, we're really not sure of the exact cause. We know this is annoying, right? It was even more annoying to research, trust me. But we do know the authorities did not mess around, quickly enacting quarantines and social distancing measures. Schools were closed, polio tends to affect children more than it does adults, and large gatherings were limited, especially those involving children, because, they presented the highest risk. Hell, at the peak of the epidemic, police were stationed at the city limits to turn people away and prevent others from leaving and possibly spreading polio further afield. However, the authorities were frustratingly limited by the knowledge of their time. For example, it wasn't known exactly how contagious polio was. Really contagious for the curious, so the roughly 99% of patients that didn't present with paralysis as a symptom were ignored, allowing polio to spread, though the aforementioned quarantine and social distancing measures did help limit this somewhat. What was less helpful, though, were the thousands of cats the city shot, believing they were a vector for the disease. They weren't, and for the curious, polio can only be transmitted via, to quote the CDC, oral contact with infected person's stool or saliva droplets, so licking poop or spit. So yeah, in regards to all those cats that they shot, that was wholly unnecessary and stands as a testament to the frequent collateral damage that arises as a result of epidemics and pandemics. Moving on, number 4, the 1793 Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic. Compared to some of the other things noted so far, this one might seem quaint, for lack of a better or more tactful word. For starters, it killed just 5,000 people. a number that would literally be a rounding error for the Russian flu. However, you have to consider that at the time, Philadelphia had a population of about 50,000, meaning this single virus wiped out 10% of the population, and technically, if you want to be pedantic about it, it realistically wipes out 50% of the population, because literally half of the city just ran away when it happened, including the entire political elite helping run the city, including one George Washington. Yes, that George Washington, he was president at the time. As for the cause, we know today it was caused by those flying assholes known as mosquitoes, though at the time it was believed to be caused by the generally off-putting miasma caused by stuff like putrefied food. They also believed the virus to be contagious, like yellow fever isn't, but you can't really blame people considering that yellow fever causes you to vomit up your own congealed blood, and who wants to go near that? But here's the thing, the sheer amount of people simultaneously dying and flying away from the city left Philadelphia with an awkward question to answer. Who was going to bury all the bodies and tend to the dying? The answer to one Benjamin Rush, a physician and signatory of the Declaration of Independence, was obvious: black people, with Rush asserting that black people must be immune to the virus because none of them had died. That wasn't the case, it's just, yeah, things were pretty sucky for black people back then, and they tended not to gather in large groups, especially near large groups of white people. So what Rush did is he basically guilted the black denizens of Philadelphia into caring for their dying white neighbours, which they did, even when the death rate for black citizens equaled that of white ones. But of course, the end result of this was white survivors gaining a mutual respect for their black neighbours and enduring racial harmony in the city. Right? Of course not, we're talking about America in the 18th century here, and the white survivors of course took the lowest possible road, accusing black citizens of trying to extort them with their caring. History sucks. Speaking of which, number 3, the Coca-Leasley epidemic. Let's move a little further back in time now and talk about what was known as simply the Great Pestilence, which is admittedly easier to pronounce than the Coca-Leasley epidemic. Coca-Leasley literally translates into pestilence in Aztec or Mexicano. Anyway, we don't really know what caused this epidemic. I know, big surprise, right? What we do know is that it was exacerbated by a number of factors, including the worst drought to hit Mexico in a millennia. As an idea of just how raw things were for the people of Mexico around the time of this epidemic, I found a study of the period titled, and I'm not making this up, Mega Drought and Mega Death in 16th Century Mexico, which is easily, without hyperbole or exaggeration, the single most metal, hardcore name I have ever seen for a published study in all my years of doing this. And I think it goes to show just how bad things got. Even normally staid and clinical experts have no choice but to use modifiers like mega to describe just how messed up things were. Numbers-wise, the Great Pestilence killed an estimated 45% of the native population of Mexico to a tune of several million people, with some estimates ranging as high as 15 million, which will make this the single deadliest outbreak of a disease ever. Number 2, the sweating sickness. Around the same time as Mexico was being ravaged by the Great Pestilence, over in Blighty, citizens were being felled by a mysterious and deadly disease known only as the sweating sickness. While we're going to refer to the sweating sickness in broad terms here, there were several outbreaks of the sweating sickness throughout the 15th and 16th century. Curiously, I could say the same thing about the Great Pestilence of Mexico. As it turns out, when people thought that the disease or epidemic had stopped, it turns out that no, some people still had it, but in smaller numbers, and then a few years later, it started again. But just for the sake of simplicity, we're going to refer to it in broad terms as a singular epidemic, even though it's more accurate to describe it as 5 separate mini-epidemics that occurred over a specific period. All on the same page? So back to the sickness, and what it was is the subject of much scholarly debate, like almost everything else listed so far, with theories ranging from anthrax to SARS. All we know for sure is it caused, as the name suggests, a terrible fever that resulted in uncontrollable sweating and then the desire to go to sleep. What made the sickness so pants-soilingly scary is that by the time these symptoms manifested, death would be mere hours away, and sleep would generally be the end of the road. Oddly though, for an epidemic, which tend to disproportionately impact the poor and the needy for a variety of reasons too complex and depressing to get into now, the short version is, poor people tend to live in crappier conditions which disease just loves. Sweating sickness seemed to target the rich, specifically rich young men. Even kings, with all their talk of divine right to rule and absolute authority over the land and its people, were not immune, with King Henry VIII famously being absolutely terrified of the sickness, to the point he hid away in his castle and quarantined his own wife. Then again, knowing what we know about King Henry VIII, it was probably the best thing for his wife that the punishment she had was to be far away from him. And finally, number 1, the 1873 cholera outbreak. Throughout history, there have been many cholera outbreaks, so many in fact we could have made a video about just them. In fact, the city in which I am recording this, Sheffield, had its own cholera outbreak in 1832, which killed some 402 people. There's a monument to those victims in the park I go for a walk with my dad each week. Of course, the number of deaths caused by these outbreaks pale in comparison to those of better-known outbreaks like the Black Death or Spanish flu, but the sheer scale of death caused by those diseases mean they're often described in abstract terms. It's one thing to say an epidemic killed 1 million people, but how many of us can even comprehend a number that large? So allow us to end on the story of the 1873 cholera outbreak in Birmingham, Alabama, which claimed 128 lives. Again, the temptation here may be to think, well, that's not so bad. But for Birmingham, Alabama, this was akin to a biblical apocalypse, as in the town was almost entirely wiped out from a combination of the deaths and subsequent fleeing of citizens from the town. Which is harrowing to think about, right? A small podunk town in the middle of nowhere that most people probably never heard of was almost wiped off the map entirely, due to a thankfully now preventable disease, and if that had happened, it'd be almost like that town never existed. The stories, the day-to-day moments that ultimately make up what we call the human experience would have, for all intents and purposes, never happened. And that's a scary thought, and one that I hope encourages people to, wash their damn hands. The amount of people I see not washing their hands is terrifying, and just makes me think, it's gonna happen again, right? But thank you everyone for watching this video. I've been your host, Karl Smallwood. I hope you found this video entertaining, educational, and informative. Maybe not the first one, but hopefully the latter two. And if you did, you can like the video, comment with feedback and suggestions, and subscribe for more content like this. I've been your host, as mentioned, Karl Smallwood. You can find me at the links you'll find below. Cheers everyone for watching. Go out there and have the day that you deserve.